So for a while now, I've been tossing around the idea of getting into top 10 lists on my channel. I always thought of them as kind of a low-hanging fruit way of getting views, so I wanted to avoid them if only for that reason. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't have plenty of ideas for them, and let's just say I finally got talked into it. Now, friends from a certain era will most closely associate me with fighting games. I was a tournament player for most of my life, and they still take up a good portion of my gaming time and energy. The thousands upon thousands of hours I've put into the genre might make it my most played, with JRPGs being the only possibility of having consumed more of my life. Thus, I feel like it would only be appropriate to start this series of videos by running down what I consider to be the greatest fighting games of all time. No one game per franchise rule here. If I feel it belongs on the list, it's going on the list. Unfortunately, this means that a lot of great games aren't going to make the cut, so I'm going to be pretty generous with my honorable mentions to compensate. If you strip a fighting game down to its core parts of risk-reward, screen control, and Yomi, the Samurai Shodown series is what you get, and it doesn't come in any greater form than Samurai Shodown 2. Mixing a deliberate and tactical pace with what was at the time a groundbreaking weapons-based approach to combat, Samurai Shodown 2 was the dedicated strategist's fighting game, setting aside the execution emphasis of its contemporaries in favor of making you purely outthink and outmaneuver your opponent. Hidetoshi Ishizawa's recent reboot of the series is outstanding, but I still have to recommend the Neo Geo collection for those who really want to relive its peak years, including this game. Now, I had to put at least one anime fighter on this list, and as much as I love BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle and the Melty Blood series, I had to go with Guilty Gear XX Accent Core Plus R, which I'll just call Plus R for convenience here. Plus R is the culmination of a years-long progression from 2001's Guilty Gear X, which saw a rather unbalanced mess of an anime fighter gradually evolve into a masterpiece where any character could pose a reasonable threat in the right hands, and you never really knew what a tournament's top 8 bracket might look like from event to event. To me, those are the best fighting games. Throw in outstanding character designs and music from renowned artist Daisuke Ishiwatari, and you have an all-time classic that still holds up to this day, even in the face of a pair of really solid sequels in Xrd and Strive. The brilliant minds at SNK, fully aware of the matchup-based nature of fighting games, built the King of Fighters franchise around the concept of team battles, letting players cover a plethora of matchups by selecting 3 characters instead of just 1. The series came with its growing pains, but once SNK's R&D Team 1 finished telling the initial story they wanted to tell, generally referred to as the Orochi Saga, they celebrated by piling most of the franchise's characters to that point into a single game with an emphasis on competitive play. The result was the King of Fighters 98, to this day the series' most enduring single installment, that still sees the very play SNK envisioned when they developed it. Today it can still be played in its original form thanks to Hamster's Arcade Archives, or a further developed and refined form in Ultimate Match. Either way, I highly recommend it. Back in 2001, the novelty of crossovers was still mostly intact, and the prospect of the 2 heaviest hitters in 2D fighting had already produced great games in Capcom vs. SNK, SNK vs. Capcom Match of the Millennium, and even a handheld card game in SNK vs. Capcom Card Fighters Clash. However, Capcom's second effort in the collaboration, Capcom vs. SNK 2, was a groundbreaking masterpiece, letting players freely choose from not 2 but 6 different sets of gameplay systems, spanning both companies' vast history, as well as distributing 4 ratio points that determine damage and stamina figures across any of 1, 2, or 3 characters chosen from a roster of 48. It wasn't so balanced that you could do whatever you wanted and compete, but there was a lot of room for player expression and creativity within a gameplay system that had a really satisfying feel to it. It's really a shame that 22 years later we still haven't gotten a follow-up. Both companies have given us plenty of new characters and gameplay systems that could make for a really interesting Capcom vs. SNK 3. The original Tekken 5 felt almost perfect when it landed on the PS2 in 2005, genuinely tapping into Virtua Fighter's energy for the very first time, and swinging with a huge roster that guaranteed you'd find a character that fit how you wanted to play. However, it was the follow-up, Dark Resurrection, that truly completed it, offering a handful of roster additions and a host of gameplay refinements that I honestly believe makes for the single greatest Tekken game to this day. The PS3 version, Tekken 5 Dark Resurrection Online, piled up all the stages and music from both the original and the follow-up, making for a timeless 3D fighting classic. Hopefully Namco makes this one available again in the form of a collection or a one-off digital release, because this is Tekken's counterpart to games further up this list. There are people who will tell you that Street Fighter III Third Strike is perfect. And while that's a little hyperbolic for my tastes, it is 1/3 of what I like to call the holy trinity of 2D fighting games. Evo Moment 37 in 2004 may have been what put the game on the mainstream map, but even the 5 years that preceded it were chock full of amazing matches and technical brilliance that proved it worthy of the Street Fighter name. You might have to experience this game in a room full of other players who know their way around it before you can truly appreciate it. I did too. But once you have that experience, you won't need any explanation why the Third Strike is what counts. Finding the sweet spot in the Soul Calibur franchise can be different for anyone. Some people prefer the original with its insane level of balance and association with the Dreamcast launch. Others might prefer 4 or 6 and their added systems and online play. Then there's Soul Calibur 2, which lands squarely in the series' Goldilocks zone with a decent expanded roster of fighters to choose from, more thoroughly thought out move lists for each, and having released before any kind of system creep started to set into it. The platform-exclusive bonus characters were controversial to be sure, and frankly nightmarish at the time as a tournament organizer. But with the arrival of the HD Online Edition, still available on modern Xbox platforms thanks to backward compatibility, we now have a single version of Soul Calibur 2 with most of the game's past characters. If only Nintendo could play better with others. If someone asked me to pick a single installment of the Street Fighter series to epitomize it, it would be Street Fighter Alpha 2, the second of the Holy Trinity to land on this list. Refining its predecessor almost perfectly, it stripped everything out of Street Fighter Alpha that didn't work, threw in a great crop of new and returning characters, including fan-favorite Sakura, and added a custom combo mechanic that may have been a little too powerful in certain hands, but was fantastic for creative and expressive players who didn't mind taking a risk rather than cashing out their super meter for a more conventional payoff. Finally, this is easily one of the most stylish games in the series, somehow blending the old-school hype vibe of the mid-90s arcade scene with a soundtrack style that gave it an unusually but effectively chill atmosphere. If you haven't somehow found your way to Alpha 2 after all these years, check it out in the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection. Virtua Fighter honestly feels like a gaming culture all its own, set apart from the rest of the fighting game community. Starting with Virtua Fighter 4, the series reinvented itself into a consistent and ongoing masterpiece that endures to this day. While Virtua Fighter 5 Final Showdown, or its recent remaster Ultimate Showdown, is the current occupant of this spot, it honestly belongs to whatever the current version of the game happens to be moving forward until proven otherwise. Wholly disinterested in what the competition is doing, Virtua Fighter goes its own way with a technical brilliance and relatively organic feel that keeps its most dedicated players committed to this day. There are no fireballs, detachable robot heads, or eye lasers here, and frankly, Virtua Fighter is all the better for it. Give it a try if you haven't found your way to it. Now, before I get to my number 1 pick, let me just touch on a host of honorable mentions. I'll try to hurry through them, but no promises. If someone was just trying to break into fighting games today, Street Fighter II Hyper Fighting is the one game I would make sure to point them at as a starting point. Like Samurai Showdown, it does a great job of simplifying the fighting game formula to make it more approachable for newcomers. Unlike Samurai Showdown, it doesn't do this at the nigh-complete expense of combos and the execution thereof, giving you a more well-rounded education of the genre. There are better Street Fighter games to be sure, up to and including the Holy Trinity, but few as historically important or useful to newcomers than Hyper Fighting. When Street Fighter IV revitalized the fighting scene in 2009, it gave rise to a new era in fighting game design, and some franchises that had previously been largely disregarded by the FGC for critical technical problems found new life under studios that knew how to handle the concept. The work of Iron Galaxy and Double Helix collectively put into Microsoft's Killer Instinct reboot was exemplary, taking the combo-intensive concept established by Rare in the mid-90s and plotting it out to a logical conclusion. The result is the biggest, deepest, most complete Killer Instinct ever, and hopefully Microsoft does more with it in the future. Another beneficiary of the post-Street Fighter IV era was NetherRealm Studios' Mortal Kombat 9. Out from under Midway, Ed Boon was free to focus on making a deep and technically sound Mortal Kombat game in contrast to the simplistic, horribly unbalanced, and frankly broken games that came before. Not only is it a fine tactical fighting game in its own right, combos at their best almost felt like Virtua Fighter. The roster made it a wonderful bridge between the old era and the new, comprised mostly of characters from Mortal Kombat 2 and Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, all refined for a tournament-focused crowd. This was the game that made me respect the series. Fatal Fury Special almost made the top 10. This was SNK's Street Fighter II Hyper Fighting, epitomizing that early SNK look and feel with some of the most iconic backgrounds and character themes of the era, and full character names under the life bars which lent themselves well to the tournament setting of each game. The gameplay holds up too, and there's still a dedicated community in Japan playing it. Consider picking it up as part of Hamster's Arcade Archives line for a beautiful snapshot of very specific era in fighting games. And when Fatal Fury grew up, it became Garo Mark of the Wolves, very much SNK's counterpart to Street Fighter III Third Strike, and another game that landed just on the cusp of the top 10. Third Strike animated remarkably well, so did Garo. Third Strike had parries, Garo had just defense. Third Strike had a variable super art system that affected how you managed your meter. Garo had the top system that affected how you managed your life bar. Both games dropped in 1999, and valid debates continue to this day over which is better. Of course, Third Strike is number 5 on my list, and this is an honorable mention, so it's obvious which side I land on, but not by as much as you might think. And with all that out of the way, my number 1 fighting game of all time is the third and final member of the Holy Trinity of 2D fighters. Super Street Fighter II Turbo is the peak form of the game that started the genre in earnest. And before anyone gets bent about that comment, check my Sound Off 4.0 video for exactly what I mean by that. Its balance is suspect in the face of more modern fighting games, but any character in the right hands can be made into a credible threat against all but the highest level tournament players. The variable game speed was a blessing after the plodding pace of Super Street Fighter II, the look and feel of Street Fighter II had never been better, and the introduction of juggle combos, secondary old character variants, and a super meter put the perfect added layers of depth onto what was already a very sound foundation. There's a reason why this 1994 epic still shows up at events like Combo Breaker and Frosty Fastings, and people are still discovering new tech and strategies to this day. Even fast approaching its 30th anniversary, it's still not too late to pick up and learn one of the most important 2D fighting games ever crafted, making it into something I can call no less than the greatest fighting game ever made. That's all for now. I'm sure there are some omissions you might be wondering about, so feel free to ask me about them in the comments, although you might find some answers in my past videos. If you enjoyed this one, please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe as it helps the channel out. Let me know what lists you'd like to see from me in the future. Click the notification bell to know right away when new videos drop. I'm Patrick Mifflin, and I'll see you back here soon.